And in another book, he refers to the fact that the destruction of the Jews and of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. was a fulfillment of a prophecy made by Jesus Christ. Now note well that the two most important historians, Jewish and pagan, of the first century confirm every basic fact of the gospel narratives concerning the historicity of Jesus Christ. Nothing more than this could possibly be wanted, and yet time does not allow for me to make allusions to numerous other writers of the period who refer to Christ himself. Well, how is all of this evidence received? Not by Christians, but by skeptics in modern times. It would not be right to tell you what Christians say, but let me call to witness other hostile witnesses. H.L. Mencken, in the first quarter of this century or so, was one of the most outspoken of unbelievers, skeptics. He was the editor of American Mercury magazine. He's described as being better educated than Robert Ingersoll, as sneering as Voltaire, and as caustic as George Bernard Shaw. Here's a man who spent 30 years denigrating the Scriptures, endeavoring to tear it apart, and finally, in his more mature years, he did what virtually every single famous critic that I have ever read about has done. He reflected more deeply upon Christ and the Scripture and said this, quote, "The historicity of Jesus is no longer questioned seriously by anyone, whether Christian or unbeliever. The main facts about him seem to be beyond dispute. The Bible is unquestionably the most beautiful book in the world." And yet this man and many others like him in numerous debates before had given the impression that the Bible was the most revolting piece of literature ever written. And yet now in mature years and deeper reflection he wrote that statement. And this, very poignant, quote, "The story of Jesus is touching beyond compare. It is indeed the most lovely story ever devised. Beside this, the best that you will find in the sacred literature of the Muslims, Brahmins, Parsis, or Buddhists seems stale, flat, and unprofitable." So spake H.L. Mencken, the critic.
Jesus' story is touching beyond compare, and the Bible is the most beautiful book in the world. If those are words of a skeptic, what do true believers have to say? We'll be back with more from Dr. Kennedy in just a moment. A good case could be made that Joseph was the unsung hero of the Christmas story. Not only did he have to take Mary to Bethlehem for a census, he later had to take her and the baby Jesus hundreds of miles on foot to Egypt to escape the violence of King Herod, and then back again. He then provided for his wife and her child as a lowly carpenter, and there's no record of his ever complaining about it. Joseph's great faith is just one of the aspects of the Christmas story that often gets lost in the shuffle, but you can read more about it and the first century world that Jesus was born into in The First Christmas. This beautiful coffee table style book makes the ideal Christmas present, and we'll send it to you for a gift of just $15 or more. Our phone number is 1-800-229-WORD. And be sure to ask about expedited shipping. I'll repeat the information again later, but right now, here is the conclusion of today's message.
Well, how about H.G. Wells? even more internationally famous, an author of many novels, and also an historian of the first rank. He wrote his famous Outlines of History, and after spending a lifetime ridiculing and demeaning Christianity and the Scripture as a radical unbeliever, he finally wrote in later years these words, quote, "Jesus of Nazareth is easily the dominant figure of history. I am speaking of him, of course, as a man, for I conceive that the historian must treat him as a man, even as the painter must paint him as a man. To assume that he never lived, that the accounts of his life are inventions, is more difficult and raises more problems in the path of the historian than to accept the essential elements of the gospel stories as facts. The historian must adhere to evidence which would pass unchallenged in every nation under the sun. The kind of evidence that he is dealing with is not bias or prejudice or faith, but is evidence which must be accepted by all intelligent historians anywhere in the world. Now he says, it is interesting and significant, isn't it, that an historian setting forth in that spirit, dealing with only that kind of evidence, without any theological bias whatever, should find that he simply cannot portray the progress of humanity honestly without giving the foremost place to a penniless teacher from Nazareth. So we discover that according to H.G. Wells, Jesus Christ is not only an historical person, but he is the foremost personage of all of the history of this planet. John Stuart Mill. From his writings and vocabulary, some have concluded that he was the most intelligent man that ever lived. He was a philosopher, an economist, the founder, of course, of the school of utilitarianism. Again, a profound and decided unbeliever who wrote many an attack against Christianity, Christ, and the Scripture. Again, however, in his later life, he wrote these words, quote, "Christ is still left, a unique figure, not more unlike all of his precursors than all of his followers, even those who had the direct benefit of his teaching. It is of no use to say that Christ, as exhibited in the Gospels, is not historical, and that we know not how much of what is admirable has been superadded by the tradition of his followers. Who among his disciples or among their proselytes was capable of inventing the sayings ascribed to Jesus, or of imagining the life and character in the Gospels? Certainly not the fishermen of Galilee, and certainly not St. Paul, whose character and idiosyncrasies were of a totally different sort, still less the early Christian writers. When this came out in print, the skeptical friends of John Stuart Mill remonstrated against him and urged him to remove it from future editions. He steadfastly refused, and in the face of considerable opposition, insisted that that paragraph be placed in every future edition of that work.